It is Monday again, and it really feels like a Monday here, as I had something go wrong in the making of this video and had to reshoot almost all of it, which meant skipping some things I was going to add on the last day. I'll just try to cover them next week instead. The audio might sound a little different today too, since I rebuilt the signal chain to try to figure out what was amiss. And also, still in glasses until we figure out what's up with my eyes. Monday. As a result of these shenanigans, I only have sections on RE0, Dan to Dan, and Blue Box today, as well as the next episode of Girls Band Cry for the rewatch. That one has turned out to be pretty dense, and took more of my time than expected. This is, however, the last week for RE0 until about a month into the winter season, so we will have more space to cover new seasonal shows in the upcoming weeks. Maybe not so much this next week, as it's Thanksgiving in the States, and I have a full house starting tomorrow. But December should see a little more variety. Even though the streams of RE0 are likewise paused, I am hoping to do a couple of Viewer's Choice selections, where a community member wins the right to choose a show and a focus for a dedicated stream. I will mention those dates when I figure them out myself. Now we will start with the last segment on RE0 for the next 2 months. So I'm oddly relieved at not having either of my original predictions for this episode come true, while also knowing that this doesn't mean they're off the table. At the very least, the decision to leave us on a high note is just going to make me brace for impact when we resume. Before I get started on the episode, then, 2 things. One is that all 8 of the Season 3 Breaktime shorts with translated captions can be found in the description of this video, a lovely effort from my community to provide a legal subtitled version. I contributed nothing, but I asked permission to share them with you to amplify the reach of their hard work. But since they are embeds from Kadokawa's channel, there's no guarantee that they will stay up until the series resumes next year, so I would catch them soon if you are interested. At the end of today's RE0 section, then, I will briefly talk about some aspects of the shorts in a separate little section, so if you want context for that, this is your chance. The other thing goes back to my original prediction for Episode 8, and is more of a macro story observation. I thought they were going to leave us on a bitter note, as Subaru and Emilia fighting after the royal selection was where the first season split in half, and Roswaal admitting he hired the assassins to kill the mansion dwellers was the big reveal where the second season split. Oto punching Subaru for trying to do everything on his own is technically the last thing that happens, but it's only in retrospect that we know that was an upwards turning point. At the time, things seemed to have only gotten worse from an already troubled state. Of course, this episode's ending could be that in reverse, something that seems like the first of many victorious moments to come, only for us to learn it's the beginning of a series of misfortunes when the season resumes. So then, here was my original prediction, that things would get increasingly worse, more characters would be sidelined or injured or traumatized, and then Subaru would die and hardly reset anything at all. A way to confirm for him and us that all this misfortune is going to stick. And while that hasn't happened yet, I do want to talk a bit about Return by Death and the audience experience, building on some things I've said before. As a time travel power, Return by Death is a dangerous storytelling tool. It must be wielded cautiously so as not to rob the series of its tension. If Subaru has no qualms about killing himself as many times as possible to try to get a perfect outcome, then there is no real threat to him or what he values, and no scene has any stakes. Thus, one thing the story has managed consistently is to preserve that sense of stakes. Some of it is baked into the power itself. He doesn't know when a reset point updates, he doesn't really know if he has unlimited uses, and he is unable to tell anyone about it. That isn't a dead witch. Who, me? Another is to make his deaths suitably horrible experiences, such that he is basically traumatized and uneager to repeat the process if he can help it. And when he does resolve to start treating his life as expendable and die as much as it takes in the second season, he quickly learns that there is a price to be paid there as well. These things communicate enough to the audience to maintain story tension. And things like Rem's state being irreversible go a long way towards keeping us worried about our ever-increasing cast. But there's also the matter of audience fatigue. Return by Death and the association with Satala is the little wrinkle in Subaru's story that has enabled everything that came after. You can't really just sideline the power entirely, as it forms part of his character identity. However, going to that well repeatedly is simply less interesting to an audience. To combat that, the series changes how the power interacts with the story as it goes along. It's introduced in the first arc to establish the story hook, and in the second, it's used to slow drip a mystery and its solution. In the third arc, it's used to characterize Subaru and his changing behavior through the failed routes, while introducing the antagonistic forces of the White Whale and the Cultist. Both in the pre-whale and post-whale resets, each loop raises our understanding of the stakes until the final path that sticks. The second season then uses the first death to up the stakes, where Subaru is unable to reverse Rem's name eating, and then proceeds to do a greatly expanded version of the mansion's mystery building before demonstrating the peril of Subaru's overuse. The second half then does something else new, by setting up the straight bet and setting out to complete all challenges without a restart. Now in the third season, we again had a new variation, the extremely short window between the reset point and the tragedy that Subaru hopes to prevent at Sirius's hands. Since then, though, no deaths at all. And I would argue that this too is something new. The second season's second half had the bet between Roz and Subaru, and we could reasonably assume that the story wouldn't cheap out on us and have him just reset anyway. This time, there hasn't been any such reason to believe Subaru wouldn't die in any of the encounters where he was involved, and yet he just keeps on living. He loses a part of a leg and the help of Betty, and no reset. Mimi is wounded in a terrible way and lingers on. Subaru loses the leg, and he and Kruge are cursed, and cursed they remain, even if in different ways. Large parts of the city are destroyed, Emilia is captured, citizens have been turned into giant flies or hunted by demi-beasts, and this punk Subaru simply won't die and turn any of it back. And in the back of our minds, we know that the longer this goes on, the less and less likely any of it is to be undone, especially with all the main cast still alive, even if worse for wear. Previously, when terrible things started happening to the characters around him, Subaru was not long for the world himself. In a sense, we have been conditioned into accepting that pattern. Right now, then, there is this slowly building apprehension that comes from the many little setbacks that are only accumulating, with no relief in sight, an itch that gets stronger and the story refuses to scratch. In our streams, we've constantly been thinking in terms of guessing where a new reset point might be, which types of encounters might be the kind that stick, and so far it has been a pointless exercise. Even though we saw the price that Subaru would pay for dying repeatedly, we might begin to wonder exactly how bad he would let things become before being tempted. Perhaps we even worry that he'd let them get worse than we ourselves can tolerate. Because of this, even the high notes of his speech and the wedding crashing are shot through with a bit of apprehension. The non-use of Return by Death, then, becomes the latest variation that keeps its story function fresh. It's been an impressive run. That all said, then, let's talk about episode 58 and pretend that there isn't this worrisome gloom hanging over all of it, shall we? The episode itself is primarily setting up what is going to happen in the second half, followed by basically a sneak peek in the form of Emilia's wedding and the crashing thereof. The credits even run early to signify this divide. It is somewhat anticlimactic to have most of an episode be about arranging pieces on the board, and so I do applaud the inclusion of Emilia and Subaru reuniting as a bit of a send-off. But I nevertheless like how the board arranging part of the episode was handled. It begins with the main assembled players around a table, a war council, and in a lesser story, that is what the whole episode would have been. Instead, we don't even make it 2 minutes before Priscilla and Liliana bust in to break up the talking heads routine. This gives an opportunity for Subaru and Otto to have a little side conference about the Tome of Wisdom, and before Subaru can return, Wilhelm requests that he visit Kruge. That scene is a different kind of one entirely, in mood and substance to all the others. Then we reverse back to the war room, and Subaru has a second two-person conference with Wilhelm, revealing the truth of the cultist identities. Back in the meeting, Priscilla is still stirring things up, claiming the Archbishop of Wrath as her own prey. It's from there, then, that we complete the conference room discussion and we know where each person is headed when the story resumes. Taken as a whole, it's still mostly an episode that could have happened around a conference table, but moving Subaru out of the room and into this series of smaller conversations breaks up that monotony. And it's not mere variety for variety's sake, as all three encounters were private ones, and all three for different reasons. And what's more, all three were also about determining who would do what in the upcoming conflict. In fact, a lot of this episode is demonstrating the early payoff of Subaru's successful speech, which technically began at the end of last week, when Ricardo and Otto and Reinhard found their way back to the party at the location of the broadcast. Priscilla, then, is the next piece. After she chastises Al a bit for sitting around here when she's out there, she will bring the speech up. And though Subaru prepares for a fight, it's the opposite. Priscilla admires metal. She says rather plainly that, as a reward, they may include her in their little plans. Considering her confidence that she and Liliana will be enough to deal with Sirius, their original forces now only need to be split among 3 archbishops rather than 4. Kruge had opened her eyes during his speech, and Felis went from looking down to looking up. After adding Subaru's visit and the odd blood transfer, which we'll come back to, Felis seems to have marshaled enough hope to be willing to end his vigil by her side. They will thus add Felis and his critical healing back to their strength. And throughout all of it, one thing is pretty plain. Subaru has become the de facto leader of the combined factions. Wilhelm will confide in him about Teresia as one of the Corps soldiers, and the intent is to keep that information from Reinhard. He is assuming that Subaru will be able to influence the ordering of their forces to prevent such, and he is right. When Subaru comes back into the conference in the middle of the debate about Priscilla going after Wrath, he is the one who arbitrates to a solution that everyone can agree to. Then there is the visit to Kruge. It turns out she wanted to see him because she was worried about him, having heard they were both subjected to the dragon blood. Even in her state, she is first relieved that he seems okay, which moves him. By chance, they discover that for some reason, Subaru can take into himself some of her dragon blood, or some of the curse, or whatever is happening. Let us not overlook that upon seeing this, Felis has no hesitation in trying to touch Kruge's hand, and then her face, to try to take it into himself. Truly a selfless knight to his lady. But sadly, it is something that only Subaru can do. And Subaru is willing to, even after realizing that it's not just a little pain, but is actually transforming him. But here, Kruge stops him. He cannot continue and risk taking himself out of the fight. He declared that everyone could leave it to him, and he must make good on that promise. This, too, is one of the burdens Al warned him about. Subaru cannot be reckless or self-sacrificing when he has put so many other fates on his shoulders. Kruge makes him repeat that part of his speech then, solidifying that he is taking on the role of leader. It's especially meaningful coming from her, someone so qualified to be the ruler that the story needs to keep nerfing her to keep things fair. A momentary tangent, but I've really been impressed by the characterization of Kruge and Felis separately and their dynamic together, and the little differences between the original Kruge and the one who has lost her memories. I hope we get to see some part of their history to add context to their relationship sometime. RE0 wields its secondary cast well, and this pair is one of the best examples. I appreciate the prominent place that their scene gets in this episode, and how much it breaks up and then refocuses all of this preparation. Anyway, all told, Subaru either directs or supports all of the assignments, and the ground is laid for the story's next steps. Let's briefly run through them, and I'll supply a few thoughts. Otto isn't going to face an archbishop, but explains to Subaru about the Tome of Wisdom and his paranoia that there might be some long-prepared scheme of Roswell's to be found inside. It's unclear whether the restoration was for the function of the tome or just to recover what might have been written, since the latter is sufficient for Otto's purposes, but presumably the archbishops would be interested in the former. Subaru will relent to let Otto set off alone in hopes of recovery, and I presume so that it's not just sitting around where the cultist could stumble over it. But I am curious at the timing of this reveal. Certainly, learning that Otto is the one who brought the tome was as big a shock to us as to the others, but learning that it has to do with a fear of something Roz did in the past is hard to square with the current crisis. Maybe the book contains information about the witch's cult, which will be useful, considering Roz had to know something about them to orchestrate the original attack on the mansion. Roz also knew that Subaru could rewind time, in a sense, But Otto learning that probably doesn't change anything in the current circumstance. So I'm really unsure where this particular thread is leading. As mentioned, Priscilla is going to take Liliana to face Sirius, though Liliana needs some convincing. Luckily, if you need someone antagonized, Priscilla is your woman. She doesn't even gradually turn up the heat. She just goes straight after her ancestors and the songs of her birthright immediately. Now, we might presume that Al will be going with them, but he's actually the only person who isn't specifically named. Even Anastasia names herself and Felis as staying put. Al was kind of distraught when Priscilla said she was going to join in, asking if she's really planning to fight the witch's cult. Last time, I mentioned that the things Al said about the cultists sounded like the voice of experience, and he seems to intentionally keep a low profile. I'm curious to see if there is any hesitation on his part to come, between his princess and his past. We also get the curious bit with Reinhard determining Liliana's divine protection by essentially downloading a divine protection of his own. Only Subaru is gobsmacked by this, so I guess it's something the rest knew he could do. I'm left wondering if that is part of the Master Swordsman power, or if it is something particular to Reinhard, and here's why. In the private conference between Wilhelm and Subaru, we learned that Teresia didn't die and then pass the power to her grandson, but passed it to her grandson, and presumably thus died without it. While Wilhelm blames himself for this, that because he took her sword from her, the power was seeking someone who would use it, basically, if Reinhard is the unique one who can download blessings, then did he inadvertently steal the Master Swordsman power? Wilhelm blaming himself and lashing out in his grief, that may be the whole story, but it'll be understandably complicated if something like that played out. Anyway, because of the reveal of Teresia as a corpse soldier, Subaru assigns Wilhelm and Garfield to deal with them and Lust. Garfield assumed he'd be going after Emilia, of course, but Subaru mollifies him with the offer of revenge for Mimi. Both then are invested into the fight over personal stakes. However, this seems like a mismatch. The two of them already fought the cultists with the help of Ricardo and Kruge and Julius, but only to a stalemate. Now you want them to face the two alone, plus Coppola, plus the demi-beasts. I understand why Reinhard tries to volunteer himself for the task. She seems like one of the harder nuts to crack. I understand keeping him away from Teresia, but I wonder if that sentiment is going to cost them. Instead, Reinhard will be going with Subaru against Regulus, sending one cheat power against another. The rather deliberate lack of information about what Regulus is actually doing in fights now kind of pays off. For if Reinhard was going against anyone else, we might already assume the outcome. We're not even sure the power we've seen from Regulus is his authority, and we've watched him make himself immune to other Archbishop attacks, like Wrath's Fire and Juice's Unseen Hands. Only catching Regulus by surprise seems to allow a blow to land, but he is oddly durable. Anyway, there are two cute little exchanges after this assignment. One where Garf begs Reinhard to help Subaru and Emilia in his stead, and Reinhard turns it around into something equal, but he also asks Garf to see his part through. It's a nice redressing of their first strained meeting. The second is when Subaru says he'll do whatever he can to cover Reinhard wherever he's lacking. This gets a shock and then a smile from Reinhard. Perhaps to most people it would never occur to suggest there was anything Reinhard lacked, but Reinhard certainly doesn't mind. I guess it's humanizing. Subaru hasn't grown up hearing about Reinhard as others would have. It's similar to the advantage he has with Emilia, not having any of the biases or preconceptions of those who have always lived in this world. They're just other people to him. Finally, we just pair the spares, sending Julius and Ricardo after Gluttony. It's at this point, I'd like to point out that although I have named them, everyone else refers to the archbishops by their sin name, wrath or greed or whatever. It makes me wonder if there is a taboo there, just as there is with using Satila's or any witch's name. If so, the archbishop's habit of introducing themselves now seems like a kind of flex or a terror tactic. However, it now also has plot relevance. The word gluttony is conjuring the image of Roy Alfard to Subaru and Julius, but is conjuring the image of Lai Batenkatost to Otto. Had they been saying their names instead of their sins, they might have discovered the discrepancy now. But instead, I think none are the wiser about possible multiple gluttonies. And even though Julius and Ricardo are the leftovers, and so we are tempted not to assign any significance to their target, I'm not so sure that's the case. Remember Joshua, Julius's little brother? Here's a question. Does anyone else remember him? We last saw him in the premiere, dispatched to deliver a letter which was highly implied to concern Gluttony, the guy who eats names and makes people forget they exist, and he hasn't been mentioned since. I presume Subaru would still remember him, but he hasn't had any cause to bring it up. A brief tangent on that, actually. I think Subaru remembers Rem and the merchant that got yoinked by the whale because of Return by Death, or specifically, because in order for Return by Death to do anything useful, Subaru has to hold on to his memory. I don't know if Return by Death is actually something inside him, or it's being used actively by Satala, or is some external automatic power, or what, but there must be some aspect of the arrangement that safeguards his memory across the threshold of death. And I think maybe the side effect is that it's stronger than the name-eating power, and neither the whale nor Gluttony can affect his memories. Conjecture, but it makes sense to me. Anyway, those are our assignments, and we also have Felt and her crew running around somewhere, as well as an escaped Heinkel running around somewhere, so there are 2 X factors that might impact one or more of the matchups, and there is some possible uncertainty about Al. But we don't have to wait until next year to get started, and so finally we have Emilia's wedding sequence. There are a few interesting tidbits in here, such as the number 79 having been left vacant and some former woman who almost had that place. Regulus also gives his prohibition against any changes in facial expression, nothing that would alter the cute face that he initially liked. And, adding on to that, when 184 tries to scoot away, he will threaten anyone who moves with being erased from the neck down. In other words, he'll kill them, but without harming their face. In that light, it really does seem like his attack on her before was just to test Emilia, since he fired right at her head. This oddity is enough to convince me of a former suspicion. Even though Regulus inquired about Emilia's virginity and stressed its importance, I don't think Regulus actually sleeps with his wives. He's collecting dolls, basically, and wants them to remain pristine. To him, I guess a virgin with a cute face is a doll in mint condition, and what collector wouldn't want his dolls to remain as such? This is at least a little different variation on his weirdness, but I will leave it to you to judge which one is actually creepier. The real meat of things, though, is Emilia's response. She has played along right up until this part, but now is going to lay out why she can't get married. Regulus's comparative patience is a testament to how much he wanted the wedding to complete without incident. And so, even though we have once again gone 0 days without violating his rights, Emilia gets a chance to say her whole piece. I enjoy that it's so shockingly defiant that all the wives forget their own prohibitions against changing expressions. But what I especially enjoy is that we are finally getting insight into Emilia's feelings on the matter of Subaru and romance. They had kissed, and Emilia doesn't seem to be ashamed to admit it, but what does their relationship look like a year later? Certainly, Subaru and Emilia seem secure now in their knight and candidate dynamic, but nothing in their interactions seemed any more affectionate than what we had already seen. So, some answers then. Emilia counters Regulus's dismissal of names with an explanation of Subaru's pet name for her, that she understands it's an expression of his feelings, that it has meaning. And she goes on to say that she doesn't yet understand what it means to love a man as a woman would. Even though Subaru says he loves her, she can't give him an answer either way, and she knows that it's cruel to him. Emilia is characterized a bit by her lack of worldliness, which we've discussed before, but this at least lets us know that she's been introspective about the matter. She knows it's serious and takes it seriously, wanting to understand before making any decision. And we can infer that for Subaru's part, he has been content to wait on this understanding, that he hasn't pushed her or rushed her, or suggested that his patience has limits. He's just going to love her and tell her so, and hope that one day it's returned. So, I guess it's nice to see the rest of her thought, that even though she doesn't yet know what it means to love someone, she knows that she will one day, and she already knows who it will be. Technically, she doesn't specify, so I'm going to guess it's Julius. At any rate, it's not Regulus, and so now his patience is at its end. He is presumably about to kill her, and she just appears to wait for it. Now, he is interrupted, but in stream, it came up to wonder if this wasn't Emilia actually slipping in to the damsel in distress bit right at the end, doing nothing to save herself. While I think it's mostly just for the dramatic effect and the ensuing humor of the scene, I think I would still say no. Truly playing the damsel would be her hoping that the wedding would be interrupted before she had to say any vows, playing along and hoping someone else intervenes to take the initiative. Instead, Emilia has no intention of being married, and she prevents it herself by declaring her own beliefs. That she may die in doing so certainly crossed her mind, but her values are that important to her. As I said in a previous video, Emilia's idealism is, for her, a source of strength. And she doesn't die anyway, thanks to Reinhard being better at kicking indoors than Subaru. I love the injection of humor here to break up the tense moment, as Subaru starts playfully complaining about how Regulus's entrance is going to look way cooler than his now. There's actually a kind of confidence in that banter, to name himself plainly weaker in front of the girl that he's come to rescue. And it doesn't matter that he isn't strong enough to do that anyway. Emilia visibly perks up when she hears his voice, and is about the most delighted we've ever witnessed when she can see for sure who that voice belongs to. For added amusement, Regulus will complain about the interrupted ceremony, that he doesn't recall there being any men on the list of invited guests. But actually, technically, he did invite Subaru to the wedding back in episode 3. At least Regulus has his priorities straight in asking what sort of gift they brought. Subaru introduces himself as the spirit knight whose spirit partner is missing, another bit of self-deprecation that comes off as confident instead, and can't help himself at the chance to do the whole "I object to this union" wedding-crashing bit. Now, certainly, being shoulder to shoulder with Reinhard might make anyone feel like they can stand a little straighter, but I'm really struck by how much downright swagger Subaru exudes in this last scene. It makes me think he is actually letting the idea of being the unifying leader take hold, and accepting the reality, he rapidly grows into it. It leaves me believing that the series when we resume is not only about taking back the city from the cult, but about seeing how well Subaru can manage as the central rallying point for the candidates and their camps. No pressure, man. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about the Breaktime shorts, which again are linked below, but possibly for a limited time. I have added them to the canon of our conversation for the streams, and so they'll be part of it when we resume next year, so be warned. Most of them are just cute little extra interactions between characters, such as a handful of conversations around Subaru's conferral of knighthood, or some scenes with the maids that were left at the mansion during the season. A way for us to get our ROM fix, basically. But there are a couple with lore in them that seemed significant, causing a little bit of disconcertion in the fanbase. Not the content of the lore, but the fact that it was introduced in the shorts instead of in the mainline anime. We probably can reason that anything in the shorts is just fun extras, and isn't necessary information to understand the main story. The anime should be self-contained, basically. What that means then is information relayed in the shorts, no matter how important it seems, will make no difference to the overall story. There's 3 things then that seem like a bit of a surprise to include. The first comes in the 4th short, where Felis discovers that Subaru has completely wrecked his gate, which I guess is due to his use of Shamak in the fight with Garfield, since we get a nice little shatter there. But apparently, that should mean that his mana will build up in his body until he eventually explodes. From Betty and Emilia's reaction, they thought he knew that. In retrospect, all the effort Emilia went through to get him healed, and the betrayal she felt when he used it against Julius, now makes a lot more sense. However, he is not doomed in this case because of his contract to Betty. Since the problem is solved with their contract, it's not a real worry, and so it can just be put into the shorts instead, right? But we didn't necessarily know that until they did so. What I mean is, if we knew in the main anime that his gate was wrecked, but Betty kept him out of harm's way, we might be worried right now that he's in trouble because she is in that catatonic state. Or more broadly, we can assume that she will never be separated from him fully because otherwise he'd die of a cause that we don't even know to watch out for. The Archbishop's requesting Betty no longer feels like as much of a worry because this information is in the shorts instead of in the main anime. The next comes in the 5th short and is the one that really got people buzzing. This short reveals that Al's chummy behavior towards Subaru has an easy explanation. He is also someone summoned from Japan. Now, I think this is actually discernible from within the main anime, especially this season. When he makes a reference to Emilia about being saved by a prince on a white horse, she of course doesn't understand. I mean, what's a horse? They have ground dragons and those wolf things that the Iron Fang ride. How does Al know what a horse is? And Subaru makes an analogy about grabbing a kid who stepped into the street at a red light. Al appears to understand. And there are some word choices here and there as well, but basically, I think it is possible to determine that Al is a fellow isekai victim, but I think it's less clear that you can assume that Subaru knows he is, as Subaru has made analogies from his world before without really worrying if he's understood. So, again, we have to wonder if this means that Al's status has no meaning when it comes to the overall story. If it was going to matter, the logic goes, it would be in the main anime. Now, it's possible we are actually being spared a headache here, that it actually never will make any difference, but if we had known it all along, we would keep expecting it to. The flip side, though, is why make that part of his backstory if it has no bearing on the outcome? He will also state that he doesn't know anyone else like them, but that feels superfluous, since we know in the mainline anime that Subaru isn't the first of his kind. This season rather explicitly names Hoshin of the Wilderness as a past visitor from Japan. The third bit then comes at the end of that same short. Al will call Betty Byako, and she'll get upset at him, saying only Subaru can call her that. And over the credits, Al will say, meaningfully, that he knows that, all too well. First of all, how does he even know the Byako nickname? And second, what is with that suspicious parting shot? That hints at some kind of insight we don't understand as the tamest option, and could mean something as wild as time travel. But because it's in the shorts, it's only confounding instead, because we're inclined not to treat it as anything, even though it seems to be pregnant with meaning. Now, if it was just one of these, maybe I don't have this conversation. But with all of them, I now find myself unsure about assuming things in the shorts won't matter to the main anime, or at least that they won't eventually be introduced there. I'm not so sure that the meta-reasoning pans out, but I also don't know how long I've got to wait to confirm that. I find myself wishing that I didn't know any of it, but, you can't unring the bell. At any rate, we will take this information with us for discussion in winter, when next we return to this story. So, last episode did a lot to redeem Aira to the audience, but what about the rest of the crew? Did witnessing the tragic story of Silky soften Aira's suspicions about Momo and Okarun? Or did the fact that they save her life make her reassess? Did Aira's own impulsive kindness soften their opinion of her? That she just didn't know better, but has a good heart? Will there be peace in our time? Well, frankly, it's funnier if there isn't, and so we get this amusing and creative Somen slurping session. The fun with framing, whether in Okarun's glasses or Aira's chopsticks, adds back a bit of the playfulness of the series, a kind of reassurance that we aren't going to be emotionally brutalized 2 weeks in a row. When the girl's subtitled speech stacks up and is interactable, or circles the frame while they likewise circle the table, we can definitely exhale in a bit of relief. And honestly, don't we enjoy it when Momo and Okarun have a go at each other, or at Turbo Granny? Let's actually not all get along. Though I do want to point out that Momo apologized to Aira about the wash tub before things get a little silly, but it seems like she actually did so because she wanted an apology for Okarun for the things that Aira said. Aww. For all Momo's fire, I like how easily she slips into a protective role towards others, and in truth, I think she is far more bothered by that than Okarun was. It had been on her mind, Aira's comment that Okarun had probably never had a decent conversation with a girl, and that no cute girl would ever touch him again, and I think that's interesting to note in light of how this episode develops. Aira isn't their new best friend or anything, and still thinks they're demons, no thanks to Seiko, part-time medium but full-time troll. But she comes back to speak to Okarun, who she at least remembers trying to save her during the part of the fight that she was alive for. And his answer is absent of motive, leading Aira to declare that he still has a human heart, and so she will work to liberate him from Momo's control. Of course, what is actually happening is a little rescue romance, one of those tropes that is definitely grounded in reality. When someone saves you, they are in effect saying that your life is worth the effort, and that validation, in tandem with the emotional high of going from danger to safety, is a powerful combination. In this case, one extra dimension, Ira believing she's a human and he's a demon. I've read enough romantasy to know that the guy being some kind of monster is not a deal breaker, but often a deal maker, and I have read no romantasy. It's a little forbidden fruit appeal. Crucially, too, Ira can reframe it to suit her main character syndrome, that she who is going to save the world might as well start by saving this poor demon's heart. Speaking of Ira's sense of self-importance, in the last video I suggested that maybe this stems from her mother's death and her father's urging that she grow up to be someone strong enough to do it all on her own. In this episode, we learn that Ira has a, shall we say, undeveloped understanding of romance, educating herself from things she's found in her father's study. This makes me think that he has been rather hands-off in raising her, and the juvenile notions that she shared are the result. What we've seen of her interactions with others seem transactional, shallow, though she does at least have the two friends, long-suffering in her wake. It's kind of wild to add another popular girl with scant romantic experience, but it's great for setting up a classic anime misunderstanding when Momo witnesses the two in a seemingly compromised position. I think Momo accepting what she saw at face value isn't so much that she's turning off her brain for the sake of injecting drama into the story, or rather, I think she believes it because she can fix the unease she has been feeling to something concrete. Ira's little declaration to Okarun unsettles her, but she doesn't exactly know why. Since he's a terrible liar, she's pretty suspicious that he's hiding something when he asks out of their lunch routine, and her friends will stoke her worry a little more. She's obviously preoccupied while on the errand for the juice, and is tempted to go peek at his classroom, though talks herself out of bothering him. The truth is, Okarun being with another girl would vex her, but she is not at a point where she can fully articulate that thought. She just knows that she feels uneasy. It's jealousy, the fear of losing something she thinks is hers, but she hasn't admitted to herself that she thinks of Okarun as hers in any capacity. I now refer you back to the apology she tried to extract, as one of the things Ira said was that Okarun would never be touched by a cute girl again. In this light, Ira's words are also an attack on her. Certainly, her friends are pretty sure that she's down bad, though amusingly they frame it as her being possessed by the spirit of a mantis shrimp. On Okarun's part of the confusion, he is mostly guilty of engaging in a common male fantasy. Lots of dudes have a similar daydream, of getting jacked up or shredded over, say, summer break, and surprising some girl with a change, shocking her into looking at him a little differently. Amusingly, he is just like Momo and doesn't articulate it in those terms to himself, thinking instead that he is doing it to be a more durable and reliable partner when things get hairy. He's a sweet little cinnamon roll, and I do believe this is his motivation in trying to work on his physique, but the part where he thinks it would be cool to surprise her, I think is evidence of a motive that he doesn't yet realize he has. In that light, Ira's misguided but forthright behavior is kind of refreshing. Also hilarious. Of course, the miscommunication lingers unresolved because we can only go just so long before supernatural beings want to get a piece of Okarun. One particular piece, that is. Since this trio has exaggeratedly different voice acting, I'm guessing they are not the same ones from the premiere, but the MO is the same. Void space, terrible disguises, banana collection. I wonder if it's coincidence that in the first instance they were after Momo, and she had an altercation with a possible romantic partner earlier in the episode. This time they're after Okarun, and he likewise had this struggle with Ira. There are some notable differences to be sure, though, like the Mantis Shrimp Abba fan and the Loch Ness Godzilla. Considering that the Serboians are telepaths, and that Momo was just interacting with Mantis Shrimp before they got cut off, is it possible that our crustacean boxer was something they pulled from her mind? And if so, does it follow that the other monster was pulled from Okarun, or from Ira's minds? I'm sorely tempted to run down a symbolism rabbit hole here, but I think I'm going to wait, see what the next episode adds. Anyway, apparently there are two things you can count on where our alien clones are concerned. They're wild about reproductive organs, and they inadvertently awaken supernatural powers in popular high school girls with limited romantic experience. If I had a nickel for every time, you know the bit. While I think we could have conjectured that taking in Silky's aura would probably have some side effects, I applaud the way they decided to debut them, giving us a great moment to end on. I'm amused that Ira takes this as confirmation that she's the chosen one, rather than her concluding that, oh no, I'm a demon too. Now, I'm just as eager to see her cool design in action as anyone else, but I'm especially interested in how this gives us something to compare Okarun's situation against. For example, the way his mood sours when transformed. If she has a similar kind of personality switch, then we know it has something to do with the yokai powers. But if she doesn't, then that tells us something also. Certainly the bone face shield that forms around her is similar to the little teeth collar of Okarun, so that is a recognizable pattern to go along with the obvious similarity in powers between the ghosts and the humans hosting them. Will Ira also have a triggering emotion to allow the change? Will it be the same as his? Will her durability as a human translate to her limits as well? And so on. One last thought. I was musing on how the different brushes with the supernatural have been rendered in the series so far, and I'm kind of amazed at the variety. There are plenty of stories that have one kind of tone or pacing or energy for their speculative fiction sequences, and then a different one for the more mundane scenes around them, a kind of oscillation between real and imaginary, which emphasizes how the story departs from the everyday. In Dan to Dan, though, the supernatural bits come in all shapes and sizes. The last episode was a somber and sacred melodrama, but the first bit of supernatural activity in this episode is this absurdist baseball routine to reunite Okarun to his recovered testicle. And then, later on, the drawn-out encounter between Momo and the Nessie Godzilla is ripped straight from a horror film, with the forced perspectives, the indistinct and shadowy shapes, and the slow-dripped tension of the awesome ripple sequence. The series seems equally at home being driven by the rule of cool as it is by the rule of funny, or mixing the grotesque with body slapstick. And it still finds time to drop a fully formed rom-com trope right in the middle of it all. Sitting back and looking at the whole, it's amazing how much this genre tag sampler platter still feels like a unified work. So D-Day has arrived in Blue Box, but we're nowhere near the end of the season. The degree to which this isn't really a sports anime is unmistakably plain this time, zooming through multiple days of multiple matches without even using half the runtime, as though we really only cared about the outcome. There are a couple of bits in there to pull out, to be sure, but this acceleration puts a lot of focus on the episode as a pivot point. The quest towards nationals has been a driving part of the story since almost the beginning, and now it's over. And we must wonder what exactly it will look like on the other side. And not just for Taiki, who fell short on his quest, but for Chinatsu as well. In a sense, her whole purpose in staying behind and living with him has now been achieved. Does she choose a new goal and stay on? Or does she feel satisfied in her accomplishment and reunite with her family at year's end? Now, for Taiki, this has always been a long shot. Both the attempt to make nationals in the first year and the hope to date Chinatsu, and yoking the two together was almost asking for disappointment. But in truth, trying to match her in goals and effort was probably the best way to chase either end. He already helped her find her resolve to stay and try again, and they are living in the same house, so you might as well tie other things together. Even leaving aside his worry about their relative status, choosing something that they can share in common was the surest way to try to draw them closer together. Even Hina realizes this, to her sorrow, after she sees the ankle bracelet and hears the story behind it. She'll bet that when practice gets tough, they'll start thinking of each other, these like-minded souls striving for the same goal. Every time they are tempted to quit becomes a potential moment to remember the other, a constant drip of attention and awareness, a kind of passive buildup of familiarity. They were increasingly becoming in sync, even right down to having their do-or-die matches on the same day. I really like the choice of the radio calisthenics to echo this, where they are literally synchronized in their motions, and it is during that activity that Taiki declares he will have something to ask her when it's over. There was such a clear pattern of their paths growing closer together, with the hope of becoming a single line when he confesses his piece, and now it's abruptly over. they are not on the same journey any longer. I like then that his exit from the tournament was equally abrupt, defeated by an unlooked-for fellow first year. And in it, too, I think we have another example of the story using its sports elements to make commentary on its romantic ones. Taiki had run into that player, Yusa, a little bit earlier, when he stopped to make sure that he recovered his stopped wallet. And Yusa will muse that Taiki is kind, but adds that kind people aren't suited for badminton. I think this is the idea of needing a killer instinct to be a winner in sports, giving no thought to the other person's dismay at losing. Taiki is too nice a guy to close the deal, basically, and since it's against his nature to go for the jugular, he is destined to fall short to those who will. If we echo that to the situation with Chinatsu, Taiki is being kind to her when he shows reluctance over asking her out, fearing that he will make her living situation awkward in the process. But that kindness might be what prevents him from winning the match, so to speak. She can hardly say yes to a confession if there is no confession. And while I'm at it, we might as well also read a lesson into his doubles match. He and Haru do lose, sure, but we spend enough time to make it plain that even against the best team, they manage to stay on the court. Taiki isn't there yet, with badminton and perhaps with Chinatsu, but it would be premature to hang up his racket. In fact, that evening he'll be passed out at the table, but rather than wallowing in his defeat, he has written advice to himself about what to do next. Chinatsu sees this, thinks about how he's not the type to dwell on the past, and adds a few words of her own, advice to herself to mirror his. Of course, losing early to some threat he didn't expect might be the real parallel, and there is some other fresh slap of reality waiting to ambush him in the episodes ahead. Chinatsu and Hina and even Haru will be preparing for nationals now, and Taiki will be the one on the outside looking in. It's a real bro move of Kyo to be worse at badminton, and so Taiki won't be completely alone. We also don't want to forget Hina's little part in the episode. I think she has come to terms with how she feels towards Taiki, and her showing up in an actual outfit is a reflection of this. She brought him snacks and was set to support him for the day, so it's a little bit awkward that he's already been knocked out. To her, he'll confess that it was always a long shot, but he thought having a lofty goal would motivate him. And though he has improved, even taking a game off Haru, he might have been fooling himself about his chances. And maybe about more than just his chances at nationals. And so, there might be a bit of a bone thrown to all of the Hina shippers out there. He'll rather like the flavor of the snack that she's brought him, and he'll declare that next time, this will be the one he gets. Well, Taiki, have you noticed that there are other flavors of girls around that you might want to try? They might become your new favorite if you do. Hey, look, if we're going to read possible romantic parallels into the sports parts, I don't see why we can't do the same thing here. Anyway, I now especially hope that Haru and Taiki try to finish that interrupted match, or play another. I mean, I have to imagine that Haru will want the practice anyway. Taiki hasn't made the cut, but what happens to his confidence if he manages to beat someone who did? Though I confess that I expect Taiki to have an uncharacteristic down period first, owing to all that I said about the shared journey being over. Maybe even bad enough for Chinatsu to take notice, though I would also expect Taiki to do his best not to make her feel like she can't enjoy her own victory just because he fell short. In fact, it's a rather bittersweet way that we finish out the episode. Taiki overhears his mother and Chinatsu talking, and is relieved to learn that they won, and she achieved her goal. His first reaction is all about her, sharing in her joy, the payoff for her hard work, but close on its heels, he remembers the bad news that he is carrying himself. I can understand not wanting to dampen her moment when he can't share his own, so he doesn't announce his presence and leaves instead. And not just leaves, but runs, as though he can't get away fast enough from this new reality. He'll think, and yet, here I am. I lost. And I dare say he means more than just the singles match. I'm sure he wants to congratulate her, and I'm also sure he wants to avoid her, and I wonder which impulse will win out. If Taiki does run away, I wonder if Chinatsu will give chase. So episode 2 takes the parting energy of the premiere's impromptu concert and channels it into enthusiasm for the new adventure of Momoko and Nina's fledgling startup band, Low on funds, but high on defiance. A second chance for both of them to prove the world wrong, and... Wait, what do you mean we're not starting a band? Okay, I certainly can appreciate how the combination of the last scene and the credits made the formation of a band seem like a foregone conclusion, only to pull something of a reversal in an episode that instead centers around Nina's struggles. That interruption in our expectations is like a vehicle lurching out of gear. It forces our attention on the incongruity. Nina's hang-ups are now not just a problem for her, but for us and the story we thought we signed up for. The circumstances in her past and how she's facing them are her main objections to getting involved with Momoka's band, but are also arguably the main reasons she should consider doing so. That seeming contradiction is right at home in Nina, as she presents this episode as someone determined to hold competing ideas in her head. Early on, when Momoka is making them dinner as a thank you, it comes up that Nina doesn't have a knife or even any dishes, and she wonders how she'll even be able to live on her own. But she then proceeds throughout the episode to try to do as much by herself as possible. She's come all the way to the big city just to escape the situation in her past, but is apparently still checking up on the popular mean girl that bullied her. And of course, she clearly loves to sing. She is unapologetically happy singing for Momoka's favor, but fights against dabbling in it with Momoka. Even seems unable to entertain the idea that she might be good at it. To Momoka, though, this messy, contradictory part of Nina is exactly what she wants in a bandmate. Making that a reality, though, won't be so simple. In fact, this anime has been far from simple so far. This time, for example, we have a role reversal from the premiere. Momoka was the defeated one last time, surrendering a dream with barely a whimper, while Nina was the assertive and defiant one who barged into her life and tried to change her course. Successfully, as it turns out, putting Momoka up for a few days while she tries to reverse her move out and reacquire her job. A U-turn in Momoka's life, and now she can climb back towards the original dream, essentially from scratch. Nina, though, seems to have used up all that disruptive energy on Momoka. Our delightful middle finger motif shows up again, as just as Momoka is packed up, preparing her restart, Nina will return the guitar and its defiant graffiti to her. It's almost as if doing this means Nina passes that spirit of the message to Momoka, and she doesn't keep any of it for herself. For Nina's following week involves her going to cram school and studying and not much else, interacting with no classmates, eating alone, and generally doing something very similar to what it seems she had been doing at home, existing as an outsider. It will then be Momoka's turn to try to disrupt her status quo, trying to coax her into music, inviting her to dinner, introducing her to Subaru, confronting her over her standoffish manner, and at the end, quite literally invading her space. Momoka senses that the things Nina is saying and doing are her going through motions, and not what she really wants if she could choose it, which is more or less what Nina did for her in the premiere. The problem, arguably, is that Nina is still aimless, as we discussed last episode. She does have a goal, it turns out, to gain admittance to university, and she is here to study towards that end, but it isn't something she really wants, so much as it's just the least worst option. In the flashback with her father, he voices something similar, that it'll be too late if you figure out what you want to be later. That is, it's framed as keeping options open, as avoiding unnecessary risk, as steering her life away from something instead of towards something. The scene itself is telling. Her father turned away from her, the overstuffed ashtray, the bandage on her forehead. The words aren't by themselves unusual. A father trying to impress on his daughter the importance of setting herself up for the future. But the other elements create a feeling of unease, of stress, a situation Nina wants simply to escape. This time, then, we have a return of movement or place as a symbolic element, but it plays out a little bit differently with Momoka's involvement. She will direct Nina to a different station, a different way to return home, points out a grocery store she can frequent, and Nina herself spins around in a bit of confusion, even running into a barrier while Momoka walks with easy purpose. The earlier instance where Nina wondered aloud if she could live alone was actually answered by Momoka, as she reminds her of herself, and that Nina will just have to tackle these things head on. Like I said last time, Momoka is like Nina shifted in time, having also dropped out at 17 and come to the city, and she now navigates things with ease. This probably contributes to her willingness to look out for Nina, and here is showing her the way in a literal sense to reflect the other guidance I think she's likely to provide. Relatedly, we have a return of that close but not quite element. Just as her apartment is not quite in Tokyo, the riverside where Nina sings is across the water from the city proper. Her singing and joy at doing so is her being so close, but refusing to join Momoko and her band is remaining on the farther shore. She says she had no idea a place like this existed in the city, and she likewise has no idea what kind of potential experiences await her if she relents and joins Momoko's group. But just as Momoko lets Nina pick which song she wants to sing, she's likewise hoping that Nina will join her because it's what she wants. And part of Momoko's tactic towards that end involves a few conversations about music itself. Last episode, we had some insight into what music meant to Nina, and this time it is Momoko's turn. Another role reversal. To me, this signals that the work isn't going to treat forming a band as just any kind of activity that people can strive toward and bond over, but it's interested in exploring the subject itself. Which is good news for me, since almost the last thing I said in the first video was that I wanted to see that theme continue. Anyway, there's three main instances. The first is as they ride the train, and Momoko shares that she thinks of a band as a group of people who have a lot of stuff they want to say. In fact, she thinks Nina should sing not just because she has a good voice, but because she has a good soul. Although, the way she describes a band as building up group pressure until it explodes sounds like the last thing Nina would be tempted by, it was clearly fun for Momoko for all that. She is nostalgic about the experience. She wants to repeat it. Nina and her mess of contradictions seem like a natural fit. After all, she had her own little version of exploding this time. The second instance is split around their nabe session. On the front end, Momoko will compare songwriting to cooking, working on multiple separate things at the same time, eventually bringing them together into something unified. The nabe itself then becomes a song metaphor. Disparate elements simmer together until their flavors seep into one another, and though the dish is shared, each still takes from it what they personally prefer, such as Nina liking her vegetables to stay in long enough to become soft. A repeat of the idea of a song having individual meanings for each person who hears it, what they take from it. Later in the meal, we get the complementary idea of the personal, individual things that go into the song. Nina shares a bit of her past, which we will return to, and Momoko's response is that she could write 5 songs just from that experience. The ingredients, if you will, are the challenging experiences and the strong emotions that arise from them. Music is the something that you can make out of such turmoil. Finally, at nearly the end, Momoko will speak about music and Nina together, and in doing so, is combining all of these previous ideas. She'll tell Nina that she's negative and complicated, but because she can't lie to herself. She's so fragile, but still hates to bend her views. And then she compares her directly to the songs she says she had forgotten about, the ones she loves and wants to keep holding on to. It's such a sweet and gentle way to validate Nina's confused feelings, and Nina doesn't disappoint in living up to Momoko's description, responding to this peacemaking attempt by telling her that she doesn't need her kindness. Last episode, Momoko seemed at one point unbothered by giving away her song, indifferent even, and it was the first point of friction between them. But now, I suspect it was a defensive indifference, putting distance between herself and the song since it's lost to her anyway. Certainly, the Momoko this episode is very interested in songs and song making. She loves them, she thinks of the humanity within them, she's introspective about the whole process, and she so badly wants to share it with others. Yet again, a reversal, but perhaps we understand why this passion was absent at the time. Her mind was on the end of it all, of leaving and admitting defeat. In that state, it would be hard to properly see all that was enticing about being a part of the music. In that light, then, we should be able to understand Nina's own reluctance, a reluctance towards joining Momoko and towards befriending Subaru, and they come from the same place. We got a peek into what lies across Nina's past in 2 different places, and I think it's worth noting the context each time. In both cases, it's around a shared meal, in fact, the same kind of meal, and the forced evening meals of her family's precepts seem to feature prominently in the environment that she strove to escape. The mental image she conjures is telling all on its own, where the meal and precepts are lighted, but her family and surrounding home are obscured. It's as though the memory of the precepts, looming over everything, and the enforced shared meals are what stick out to her. In fact, I found myself wondering if she is having a bit of trauma response from these shared dinners with Momoko. Anyway, the family precepts are not themselves enough to explain Nina's distress. Eating dinner together, a regular family meeting, a ban on phones in their shared space, that could actually be a wholesome set of goals. Keeping a family communicating, not just becoming strangers that occupy the same space. But with the limited insight we have so far, it seems as though the precepts are more of a symptom of a stifling and controlling environment. If her parents are proud of enforcing them, as Nina says, then perhaps they are more performative. Something for appearances, in absence of the familial warmth and unity that they would imply. Certainly, they could be a big disruption to the girls' social lives. If there's always a meeting on Sundays, then perhaps it interferes with making weekend plans with friends. If they must always eat dinner at home, then perhaps that means no after-school clubs, no karaoke, no visits to friends' homes. If phones are forbidden in the living room, but they are often required to be in the living room, then being cut off from calls or messenger just compounds the situation. If they insist on those rules in spite of the way they isolate Nina, then that doesn't build a happy family, it just builds resentment. Now, while that is conjecture on my part, Nina does share that her schoolmates found out about the precepts, and I think the way they'd interfere with her being able to socialize like the rest might be why. At that point, the precepts lead to fresh grief, an oddity that makes Nina a target for bullying, and by none other than the most popular girl and her friends. This no doubt isolates her further still. Worse, though, is the impression that her family regards the bullying as no big deal, even though Nina was hospitalized during some encounter. In such a situation, I can imagine Nina beginning to question herself, or being tempted to mold herself to the expectations of others to make her life easier, but it sounds like she's done nothing of the sort. She refuses to believe that she was the one in the wrong, which means everyone else was in the wrong, and I can imagine that the whole ordeal leaves Nina with rather pronounced trust issues. Indeed, Nina might even self-sabotage any attempts to form new relationships, pushing others away before there is any opportunity to be hurt by them. Remember her reluctance to accept help from her new neighbors, despite how desperate her situation. And this time, attending cram school and being surrounded by peers without ever speaking to anyone at all. The actual oddity is that she was able to connect to Momoko. I guess her song seemed like such a lifeline in Nina's desperate state that she basically fangirled her way past her own hang-ups long enough to make a new friend. However, when it comes to something like joining a band or being a singer, Nina might also be self-sabotaging. Giving up on the idea early may be easier for her to bear than trying something she might fail. After all, her whole move and college entrance plans are framed as her trying not to lose. She's taken too many L's, basically, and she can't risk another one in her fragile state. And what a fragile state it is, as evidenced by everything after Subaru's introduction to the episode. She's skipping for joy to have an excuse to see Momoko again, but Subaru's entrance is a hard left turn. Even the music drops away unceremoniously. While springing any friend on Nina would probably set her on edge, here is someone her age in a school uniform, just like those who were bullying her before. One thing I really liked about the third character introduction is we have this little pattern of good intentions that don't automatically lead to good results. Momoko no doubt wants to introduce them because she hopes they'll all make music together, and highlighting Subaru's age makes me think that she was hoping to help Nina make new friends in the city. Subaru can actually pick up on Nina's discomfort and tries to extract herself from the dinner plans, but she gives way to Momoko's own intent. The lamp which provided the reason to get together is actually from her, which, in retrospect, seems like something less happenstance than presented. Momoko knew she needed a lamp and figured she needed new friends and wrapped them up together. Their dinner, then, is the other place where we gain insight into Nina's past, this time only in a flashback that the audience witness and Nina relives. Again, there are good intentions, such as Subaru trying to engage with Nina to ease the conversation, but Subaru and Momoko are musicians. They have more in common, and the conversation about music and concerts becomes one that Nina cannot contribute to. She is there in body, but in a sense is alone, and that sensation seems to tilt her into the dark memory. It's great work to do so much with so little. There's no dialogue, a shot of the water over the desk and floor, the wide view of the classroom where other girls pointedly ignore her, darkened and desaturated rendering to echo the mood. And then her acceptance, as she simply sits in the midst of the mess. Bullying, ostracization, and defeat, and all the while, Subaru and Momoka's conversation continues without her as dull background din. Her friendship with Momoko suddenly doesn't seem like a fresh new chapter in her life, but a return to the same social dynamic she left, where she is perennially the outsider. She's wrong, though. Even though she retreats to the restroom, Momoko doesn't allow her to give up before starting, and confronts her about her attitude. What Momoko will say about her later is relevant here, that Nina is so negative and complicated because she can't lie to herself. Nina does not feel comfortable, and she knows Subaru is intentionally trying to make it easier for her. It galls her regardless of the intent, and she won't pretend that it doesn't. I think for Nina to have held on to herself to this point has required a lot of stubborn faith in her own viewpoint. But that inflexible nature is no asset when it comes to the give and take of relationships. Ultimately, she doesn't like the situation, and so she does not stay in it. What perhaps rescues Nina a bit for the audience, though, is what happens afterwards. Once removed from the discomfort of the conversation, Nina can accurately assess Subaru's intent, her kindness and patience in trying to connect to her, and she chastises herself for her behavior. I'd like here to highlight something about Nina that I think also grows out of the past we've seen. Nina seems to be reluctant to show emotion in front of others. The way she goes cold on the phone with her family, the way tension boils out of her in animated lines rather than words, the way she only cries over Momoko moving out once she's alone, the way she just sits at the wet desk rather than make a scene, and the way she excused herself to the restroom during the meal. All of these seem like someone who has been discouraged from expressing herself, or has met with ill outcomes when she does. I think it's significant that she's been able to show a little fire towards Momoko, but that still was just a kind of raised edge to her voice. Now that she's alone on the street, though, she is free to pour it all out. Tears at first, and then anger as she shouts at herself. In the premiere, when someone yelled at her because the sound of her luggage bothered them, she meekly complied and picked her stuff up. This time, the complaint is far more valid, but our hapless bystander has terrible timing, running into a Nina who is uncorking a lot of pent-up frustration. Anger at oneself is some of the hardest to bear, and so any external target looks tempting by comparison. She shoots him the pinky bird, and he doesn't understand. And of course not, as the person who could understand is the one she just ran away from. So Nina lets even more anger out, and in her moment of madness, she even smashes the gifted lamp, recklessly and thoughtlessly, the same as she smashed up the dinner date. The light as metaphor isn't done there either. Despite being partially shattered, Nina brings it home, but cannot plug it in. She can't do it alone. Any of it, seemingly, and she melodramatically claims that she'll never escape the darkness. On cue, Momoko and Subaru let themselves in, and while Momoko tries again to convince Nina to join them, Subaru will plug in the light. This time, Subaru won't be unfailingly polite, but calls Nina a pain, and gets a punch in the shin for her commentary. Well, Subaru had offered Nina a blemishless, pristine friendship introduction, and she threw it back at her. So now she gets the cracked and jagged one instead. But the cracked and jagged lamp works all the same, and Nina's apartment is filled with light. Last episode we began and ended in train stations, and this time we begin and end in this room. But we started with darkness, with Nina's eyes closed, and we end in light, imperfect though it may be. There's also a nice little callback to the first scene in the milk. Momoko had taken Nina's milk in her hungover state, but Nina is inflexible, annoyed because she had asked if she'd wanted any the night before. I have to imagine Nina has very little experience with drunks or hangovers, and she isn't sympathetic. She won't put herself out to help ease Momoko's self-inflicted pain. Now at the end, you guessed it, the roles are reversed, and Nina is the one who has gotten herself into a world of hurt. But Momoko is sympathetic in her turn, and has brought her a gift of the same milk. Receiving it, she bursts into tears. And while there's a kind of amusing chaos to that last bit of her crying while the other two laugh, remember what I said earlier about Nina showing emotion. These unselfconscious displays of anger and tears in front of them is perhaps progress, perhaps a harbinger of a more flexible and honest Nina to come. Okay, time again for the casual version of our 5 masters. For goals, we did learn that Nina is here to study towards admittance to college, but it seems like a goal of last resort. We want to enumerate the goals of characters because striving towards them is part of the engine of the plot, but this hardly seems like one to motivate her. If anything, it seems more apt to hold her back. For Momoko, though, it's more clear. She wants to form a new band, but seemingly just because she loves music and she wants to do it again with other people who have something to say. That motivation is plain to see in her actions this episode, both in recruiting Subaru and in the way she talks about music to Nina. More specific goals on this front will no doubt arise in time, but we can track her progress and understand her decisions. For Subaru, we don't really know enough yet. She's in acting school, but we don't know to what end, and joining the band implies some interest there, but it may be different from Momoko's. Hence are all we have for now. Last time in Conflicts, only the multiple mentions of finances gave us anything concrete, but this time around it seems less of a concern. Nina is limited in how often she can attend cram school, so funds aren't unlimited, but she isn't shown to search for part-time work, and Momoko apparently manages to just go back to what she was doing. Maybe Subaru will turn out to be a rich girl. We can, however, add Nina's internal state as a source of conflict that needs addressing. Momoko is motivated towards that end at least, and I feel like everything after Nina left their dinner might mean that she'll be open to facing her demons. Certainly, Momoko already suggested that songwriting could be an outlet. Characterization is, again, a lot of what we already discussed. It's a good chance it will be that way most episodes. I think the striking difference in Momoko this episode compared to last is the most noteworthy thing, even though Nina's characterization makes a stronger impression. The two really work together, actually, as Momoko's shift and her patience in dealing with Nina are probably both due to Nina's actions in the premiere. Nina's impulsive and stubborn actions last time kept Momoko from going all the way through with her plan to abandon music, and all her romantic descriptions this time suggest to me that she really is grateful that Nina was so stubborn. In that light, how can she not just put up with Nina, but try to give her a little help as well? Nina is a handful, but that's more of a problem for the other girls. For us, she will make an interesting character, one who is already in flux. Subaru's time is brief, but is used pretty efficiently. She was observant in knowing Nina didn't want her to go to dinner, courteous in trying to excuse herself, patient in trying to engage Nina despite little cooperation, but then willing to throw a little shade her way once the time for politeness is over. An actor and a drummer is an interesting combination, one defined by being in the spotlight, and the other for being the supporting rhythm hidden behind their kit. I wonder which, if either, most informs her personality. For world-building, we have the beginnings of Nina's history that led to our inciting events, and a more concrete idea of what she is doing near Tokyo. Though we have the actions clear enough, the dropping out due to bullying, the attempts to get into college all the same, I suspect we don't have a complete picture of all that transpired. Nina will claim she has no idea why she in particular was picked on by the popular girl, but we also just saw Nina try to assault some poor dude with a lamp, so who knows what kind of incidents occurred in and around the bullying period. We can also add that Momoko has successfully begun starting a band, and I approve of the choice here, as she will add Subaru in the meantime and not stop everything to try to win Nina over first. The band can be assembled and introduced into the story without having to give Nina's own hang-ups short shrift. In theme, I belabored the point, but role reversal was all over this episode. A lot of it focused on Momoko trying to give back to Nina or to look out for her. Taking that and pairing it with her nostalgic musing over being in a band, I can imagine we're going to get a lot of focus on interpersonal dynamics and how that relates to music making. Maybe that will be a distinct thread, or maybe it will be part of the aforementioned idea, the very personal side of what goes into a song and what one takes out of it. That one at least seems primed to stay. I do wonder, however, if Momoko's description of the band whose pressure built up to the point of exploding may not be a bit of foreshadowing. Otherwise, I think that aimlessness idea is still lingering, reflected in more symbolic use of place or movement. We also had a return of symbolic elements that have shifting meaning. The milk and the lamp, I mentioned those already, but the middle finger gets a new variation to the pinky finger instead. In the premiere, Nina accidentally but happily flips off the workers, and then defiantly flips off the whole world, basically. And in this one, it's like she aimed for a middle way, a pinky-sized bit of defiance, an inoffensive bit of rebellion, instead of the full send. That certainly could describe her behavior throughout most of the episode, with the great irony of her using it herself and then taking the most wildly aggressive action yet. Maybe she's trying to make her defiance more presentable, but it hasn't actually shrunk at all. Anyway, that's all. I think with that last chaotic scene, we are truly underway. After all, it's got girls, and band, and cry. Boo! Get off the stage! See you next time.